Colonel Brennan had handed Captain Nadia Vesper the keys to Delta Company with a tone that suggested he was handing her a resignation letter. His exact words were simple and devastating. "Nobody expects miracles with this unit, Captain. Just keep them functional until we can redistribute the personnel." Delta Company had failed every readiness inspection for 18 months, had the highest disciplinary rate at Fort Lewis, and was considered a dumping ground for problem soldiers that other commanders didn't want. Brennan gave her the assignment on a Friday afternoon with the kind of smile that said he expected her to fail quietly. He had no idea that Nadia had spent 3 years turning around failing units in Afghanistan, or that she'd been waiting her entire career for a command that everyone else had given up on. Captain Nadia. Vesper was 32 years old and currently standing in front of Delta Company's headquarters building at Fort Lewis, Washington, watching soldiers drift toward formation 15 minutes late. The November rain was the kind that soaked through everything slowly, and the company area looked like nobody had cared about maintenance in months. Trash overflowed from containers near the motor pool. Equipment sat uncovered in the rain. The entire atmosphere felt defeated before she'd even met most of her soldiers. Nadia had taken command of Delta Company 3 days ago, a logistics unit responsible for supply distribution and transportation support. On paper, they had the personnel and equipment to be one of the brigade's most capable companies. In practice, they were known across Fort Lewis as the unit where careers went to die. Soldiers got assigned to Delta as punishment, or because other commanders had given up on them. Leadership positions went to officers who'd been passed over for better assignments. She'd spent the last 72 hours reviewing personnel files, maintenance records, and inspection reports. What she'd found was a unit that had fallen into a cycle where low expectations created poor performance, which reinforced the low expectations. Nobody believed Delta could succeed, so nobody tried very hard, which ensured they continued failing. If you want to hear how one officer transformed a failing unit into the brigade's best, hit that subscribe button. These are the leadership stories that show what's really possible when someone refuses to accept defeat. Nadia had grown up in Detroit, where her father ran a small manufacturing business that had been struggling for years. She'd watched him turn it around not through dramatic changes, but through relentless attention to basic systems. He'd fixed equipment that had been broken so long people forgot it could work. He'd held employees accountable to standards they'd stopped believing mattered. He'd convinced people who'd given up that they were capable of more than they thought. Her mother had been a high school principal in one of Detroit's most challenging districts, and she'd taught Nadia something equally important. People lived up or down to the expectations set for them. Students who were treated like failures became failures. Students who were challenged appropriately and supported consistently often exceeded everyone's predictions, including their own. When Nadia joined the army at 23, she'd brought both lessons with her. She'd worked her way through logistics officer training and deployed to Afghanistan, where she'd ended up commanding a small supply depot that had been failing every audit for months. She'd spent 3 months implementing basic systems, holding people accountable, and showing soldiers that they were capable of excellence. By the end of her deployment, that depot had the highest ratings in theater. She'd done it again with a transportation unit that had been considered dysfunctional, turning them into one of the most reliable companies in their brigade. But those successes had been during deployments, in temporary situations where the stakes were obvious and people accepted that change was necessary. Taking command of a failing stateside unit was different. These soldiers had been living with failure so long it had become their identity. Nadia's first company formation had been revealing in ways that confirmed everything she'd read in the reports. Soldiers had showed up late, in uniforms that didn't meet basic standards, with an attitude that suggested they were doing her a favor by appearing at all. First Sergeant Kyle Morrison had tried to maintain order, but seemed exhausted by the effort, like someone who'd been fighting losing battles for too long. After the formation, she'd met with her leadership team. Morrison had been honest in a way that felt like defeat. He'd told her that Delta Company had good soldiers buried under layers of institutional failure. That previous commanders had either tried to fix everything at once and burned out, or had given up immediately and just processed paperwork until they could leave. That the soldiers had learned not to invest effort in improvement because leadership always left or stopped caring. Lieutenant Sarah Chen, her executive officer, had been more frustrated. She'd explained that other companies actively avoided working with Delta because they were unreliable. That maintenance deadlines were missed so often that higher headquarters just stopped expecting compliance. That the company had developed a reputation as the unit where standards didn't apply. And that reputation had become self-fulfilling. The real problem had become clear during her first meeting with Colonel Brennan. He'd told her explicitly that he wasn't expecting her to fix Delta Company. The unit was scheduled for reorganization in 18 months, and his priority was just keeping them marginally functional until then. He'd assign her additional personnel if she needed them, give her lower priority missions that wouldn't hurt the brigade if Delta failed to execute them properly. His tone had made it clear he'd already written off her command before she'd even started. Major Rachel Torres, the brigade logistics officer, had been more direct when Nadia had requested access to better equipment and training resources. She'd pointed out that Delta Company had been given those resources before and had wasted them through poor maintenance and lack of follow-through. That the brigade had limited assets and couldn't afford to invest them in a unit that wouldn't use them properly. That Nadia should focus on basic functionality rather than trying to compete with the brigade's capable companies. Nadia had spent her first weekend as commander walking through every part of the company area alone. The motor pool where vehicles sat broken because nobody had submitted maintenance requests properly. The supply room where inventory was so disorganized that finding basic items took hours. The barracks where soldiers lived in spaces that suggested nobody cared about their environment because nobody had shown them they should. What struck her most wasn't the physical decay, though that was significant. It was the emotional atmosphere. Soldiers who avoided eye contact because they expected criticism. NCOs who went through motions without believing anything would improve. A first sergeant who was competent but had stopped believing his competence mattered. She thought about her father's manufacturing business, about how the physical environment had reflected the company's self-image. When the shop floor was dirty and equipment was broken, employees had treated their work carelessly because the environment told them their work didn't matter. When he'd cleaned, organized, and fixed things, people had started taking pride in what they produced because the environment told them their work was valued. She thought about her mother's students, teenagers who'd been told they were failures so many times they'd stopped trying. How her mother had changed that, not through inspirational speeches, but through consistent demonstration that their efforts would be recognized and supported, through setting standards and helping students meet them, rather than lowering expectations to match current performance. Delta Company didn't need a miracle. They needed someone who believed they were capable and was willing to do the unglamorous work of proving it systematically. Someone who wouldn't give up when progress was slow or when setbacks happened. Someone who understood that turning around a failing unit wasn't about dramatic changes, but about fixing 1,000 small things until the cumulative effect shifted the entire culture. Nadia's first priority had been establishing basic standards and holding everyone accountable equally, starting with herself. She'd arrived at the company area every morning at 05:30 and stayed until the last soldier left. She'd inspected vehicles, checked maintenance records, reviewed supply inventories. When she found problems, she'd fixed them personally or taught soldiers how to fix them correctly. The soldiers had been skeptical initially, expecting her intensity to fade like previous commanders. But after 2 weeks of consistent presence, something had started shifting. Specialists who'd been coasting had started showing up on time because they knew she'd notice if they didn't. NCOs who'd stopped caring had started enforcing standards because she was enforcing them higher up. First Sergeant Morrison had been her most important ally. In a private conversation, she'd asked him directly whether he believed Delta Company could become functional. He'd admitted he'd stopped believing it years ago, but that watching her work for 2 weeks had reminded him why he'd become a first sergeant in the first place. They'd agreed on a simple pact. They would hold soldiers accountable to standards consistently, provide resources and training needed for success, and never accept excuses for failure, while also never giving up on people who were genuinely trying. The first real test had come during a brigade logistics exercise at week 4. Delta Company had been assigned a basic convoy operation, transporting supplies from Fort Lewis to a training area 60 miles away. Previous attempts at similar missions had resulted in broken vehicles, missed timelines, and lost equipment. Colonel Brennan had assigned them the mission with obvious reluctance, apparently planning to use their expected failure as justification for the reorganization. Nadia had spent a week preparing her soldiers. They'd inspected every vehicle thoroughly, completed all maintenance, rehearsed load plans, and practiced radio communications. She'd made it clear that this mission would be executed to standard, or they'd keep rehearsing until it could be. Lieutenant Chen had coordinated logistics with an attention to detail that surprised support units used to Delta's usual sloppiness. The convoy had executed perfectly. Every vehicle operational, every timeline met, every piece of equipment accounted for. When they'd returned to Fort Lewis, Major Torres had been waiting at the motor pool with an expression that suggested she'd expected to be coordinating recovery operations instead of observing a successful mission completion. But success created new problems. Other companies had started requesting Delta's support for missions, and Nadia couldn't afford to fail now that expectations were rising. Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, one of her vehicle maintenance NCOs, had pulled her aside and admitted that the company didn't actually have the technical expertise to maintain their operational tempo. They'd succeeded on the convoy through intensive preparation, but they couldn't sustain that level of effort across multiple simultaneous missions. The crisis had come at month 4, during the brigade's annual logistics readiness inspection. Delta Company had failed this inspection for 6 consecutive cycles, and everyone expected them to fail again, despite Nadia's improvements. The inspection tested everything: vehicle maintenance, supply accountability, communication systems, personnel readiness, and mission execution under pressure. Nadia had prepared her soldiers for 3 weeks. They'd practiced every inspection station, corrected every deficiency they could identify, and rehearsed until basic tasks became automatic. But on the first day of inspection, their primary communications vehicle had suffered a catastrophic equipment failure that should have disqualified them from continuing. Staff Sergeant Webb had come to Nadia with a choice. They could request to postpone their inspection, which would be granted given the equipment failure, but would reinforce Delta's reputation for unreliability. Or they could continue using backup systems and jury-rigged solutions that met the technical requirements, but looked improvised and unprofessional. Nadia had made a decision that defined her command philosophy. She'd told Webb they would continue with backup systems, but they would explain their solution clearly to inspectors rather than trying to hide the improvisation. That demonstrating ability to adapt and continue mission execution despite equipment failure was more valuable than presenting a perfect facade that couldn't handle adversity. The inspection team, led by a lieutenant colonel from division headquarters, had noticed the backup communications immediately. When they'd questioned Nadia about it, she'd explained the equipment failure, showed them the maintenance records proving they'd properly maintained the primary system, and walked them through her decision process for continuing with alternatives. She'd acknowledged that it looked less professional than using primary systems, but argued that logistics units needed to function when equipment failed, not just when everything was perfect. The lieutenant colonel had paused the inspection and called Colonel Brennan to the site. In front of Nadia's entire company, he told Brennan that Delta Company was demonstrating more tactical flexibility and problem-solving ability than several units he'd inspected that had perfect equipment but no ability to adapt. That their willingness to continue mission execution despite setbacks was exactly what the Army needed in logistics units. Delta Company had passed the inspection with a rating of satisfactory, the first passing grade they'd received in 2 years. More importantly, they'd passed while openly acknowledging a significant equipment failure and working through it, rather than hiding problems or making excuses. The transformation had accelerated after that inspection. Other commanders had started requesting Delta Company for difficult missions rather than avoiding them. Soldiers who'd been considered problems in previous units had started performing well, because they were finally being held to consistent standards with proper support. First Sergeant Morrison had told Nadia that he was staying at Fort Lewis for another assignment rather than retiring, because Delta had reminded him why he'd stayed in the Army. By month 6, Delta Company had the highest operational readiness rate in the brigade. Their vehicles were maintained properly. Their supply accountability was flawless. Their soldiers were showing up on time, in proper uniform, ready to work. The physical company area had been transformed from neglected to professional, not through dramatic renovation, but through daily attention to basic standards. The brigade commander had visited for a formal assessment, comparing Delta's current performance to their status 6 months earlier. The improvement had been so significant that he'd cancelled the planned reorganization, and instead designated Delta Company as the brigade's primary logistics support unit for an upcoming deployment rotation. Colonel Brennan had called Nadia to his office and admitted something that clearly bothered him. He'd told her that he'd given her Delta Company expecting her to fail, that he'd seen it as a way to identify whether she was capable of higher command, that he'd been wrong to set her up that way, but that her success had taught him something about leadership he'd forgotten, that low expectations were often the biggest obstacle to performance. Major Torres had been more direct. She'd requested Nadia's methods be documented for use in training other commanders who inherited struggling units. The resulting guide focused on consistent standards and systematic improvement rather than dramatic intervention, had been distributed throughout the logistics corps. The real validation had come from the soldiers themselves. Specialist Jordan Hayes, who'd been transferred to Delta as a disciplinary measure, had told Nadia that joining the company had felt like punishment until she'd realized it was actually an opportunity to be part of something that mattered. That failing with Delta had felt like confirmation of her own inadequacy, but succeeding with them had shown her she was capable of more than she'd believed. Nadia had been promoted to Major 8 months after taking command and selected to attend the Army's Command and General Staff College, a clear indication that her career was advancing. But what she was proudest of wasn't her own success. It was watching First Sergeant Morrison train new NCOs using Delta's turnaround as an example. It was seeing soldiers who'd been written off by other commanders, thriving under consistent leadership. It was knowing that a unit everyone had given up on was now one of the brigade's most reliable assets. They'd handed her a failing unit as a test she was expected to fail. She'd turned it into the brigade's best not through miracles or dramatic interventions, but through the simple act of believing her soldiers were capable and doing the daily work of proving it. Sometimes that was all leadership really required, refusing to accept that failure was inevitable and showing people they were better than anyone had told them they could be.